Number 1. The Tupi pre-salt microbialites. Picture the drill string dropping away from a platform off the coast of Brazil. It falls through 2,000 meters of open ocean before it even touches the seabed. Then it bites into rock another kilometer, then 2. And then it reaches a wall that should not be there. A layer of pure salt, in places 2,000 meters thick, sealing the deep like a lid on a tomb. In the year 2006, a Petrobras well with the designation 1BRSA369A, nicknamed Tupi, pushed through all of it. What waited on the other side, 5 to 7 kilometers beneath the waves, was the largest oil discovery in the Western Hemisphere in decades. The field was later renamed Lula, after the giant squid. Here's the part that should make you stop. The rock holding that oil was not built by rivers or volcanoes, it was built by microbes. Geologists call these formations microbialites, carbonate stone precipitated by mats of bacteria in ancient alkaline lakes. The rock is between 110 and 125 million years old, from the early Cretaceous. Back then, there was no South Atlantic Ocean at all. South America and Africa were still locked together, tearing apart along a great rift valley. In the lakes that pooled in that wound, cyanobacteria laid down stromatolites in strange shrubby textures, layer by microscopic layer. As the rift widened, seawater flooded in and evaporated, again and again, leaving the immense salt seal. Salt flows slowly, like cold honey, and it forms a perfect cap. For more than 100 million years, it held the oil prisoner. The modern echo of this world is Lake Tanganyika and the alkaline lakes of the East African Rift, where microbes build similar stone today. The mainstream view treats this as a textbook rift lake system. But there is debate over how much of the carbonate is truly microbial versus precipitated by raw chemistry, and a more speculative camp wonders how deep the living biosphere reached. Whatever the answer, the consequence is staggering. The pre-salt province, including Bucios and Sapinhoá, holds tens of billions of barrels, and Bucios is now among the largest deepwater fields anywhere on Earth, with some of the most productive wells ever drilled. There's a mirror image of all this across the ocean. Because South America and Africa were once joined, the same rift lakes ran along what is now the coast of Angola, in the Kwanza Basin, the geological twin of the Santos Basin. When the pre-salt boom proved that oil could hide in microbial stone beneath kilometers of salt, explorers turned straight to that conjugate margin. To make any of it work, Petrobras teams had to solve a brutal technical problem first, because seismic waves bend and scatter as they pass through salt, so imaging the reservoir below it was like trying to photograph a room through frosted glass. A lake built by bacteria before the Atlantic existed now powers a modern nation, and it was almost the least disturbing thing the drills found. Number 2. The Binagadi Asphalt Lake. Most people have heard of the La Brea tar pits in Los Angeles, where saber-toothed cats and mammoths drowned in asphalt. Almost no one has heard of its twin on the other side of the world. On the Absheron Peninsula near Baku, in Azerbaijan, sits one of the oldest oil regions on Earth, a place where natural gas seeps have burned with eternal flames for thousands of years. Those fires gave rise to fire worship long before anyone drilled a well. And buried in the asphalt-soaked sand there lies a graveyard. It was found in 1938 when workers extracting material noticed bones in the tar. Soviet paleontologists moved in, among them Nikolai Burchak Abramovich, who spent decades describing what came out of the ground. The deposit dates to the late Pleistocene, the last ice age, with estimates often near 120,000 years, though the dating is still argued. Tens of thousands of bones have been recovered, a near-complete snapshot of an ice age ecosystem frozen in tar. The roll call is haunting: steppe rhinoceros, wild horses, aurochs, the giant wild cattle, saiga antelope, deer, wolves, hyenas, and a great cat that may have been the cave lion. And then the birds, more than 100 species, making Binagadi one of the richest fossil bird sites of the entire Pleistocene. Insects, plants, and snails came too, enough to rebuild the climate of the time, a cool steppe stretching around the Caspian. The trap worked the same way it did at La Brea. A thin film of tar over water or sand catches a heavy animal. Its struggling and bellowing draws predators and scavengers, who wade in and are caught in turn. This is the predator trap hypothesis, and Binagadi lets scientists test whether tar pits truly overcount meat eaters. Why is it nearly unknown in the West? Mostly because the work was published in Russian during the Soviet era and never crossed over. The asphalt stained every bone a deep brown and black, exactly as it did in California. The plant pollen recovered alongside the bones points to a cooler, drier steppe than the green hills around Baku today. A snapshot of an ice age climate. The saiga that died there survives today only on the steppes of Central Asia, and it is critically endangered, a quiet measure of how much has been lost. Baku oil has been exploited since antiquity, described by Marco Polo, and producing roughly half the world's oil by the late 1800s, so this is petroleum's oldest heartland. Here, in the heart of that oil district, the same substance that built the industry also preserved the dead. But preservation is gentle compared to what the next field exhales. Number 3. The Tengiz buried reef. In the flat steppe of western Kazakhstan, near the Caspian Sea, there is a field that drillers approach the way bomb technicians approach a device. Tengiz was discovered by Soviet geologists in 1979, and it holds billions of barrels of oil. The reservoir is a single colossal structure, an isolated carbonate platform that is, in plain terms, a fossil reef atoll. It is more than a kilometer thick and covers hundreds of square kilometers. Between 330 and 360 million years ago in the Carboniferous, this was a warm, shallow sea, alive with corals, crinoids, bryozoans, and algae, all building stone in the sunlight. That sunlit reef is now buried 4 to 5 kilometers down under crushing pressure, and it breathes out poison. Tengiz oil is what the industry calls sour, meaning it carries hydrogen sulfide, and at Tengiz, the concentration in the gas runs as high as 15 to 20%, among the worst on the planet. Hydrogen sulfide at around 1,000 parts per million can drop a person before they hit the ground. Worse, at high doses, it deadens the sense of smell, stripping away the rotten egg warning that might save a life. The reef does not give up its oil quietly. On the 23rd of June 1985, an exploratory well known as Well 37 blew out. The fire that followed burned for more than 400 days. The flames climbed hundreds of meters into the sky and could be seen from space. It took crews well over a year to kill it. Even now, the combination of great depth, extreme pressure, and lethal gas makes Tengiz one of the most dangerous places on Earth to put a drill bit. The field also produces elemental sulfur as a byproduct, millions of tons of it, stacked in vast bright yellow blocks across the Kazakh landscape, a controversy in their own right. The hydrogen sulfide comes mainly from thermochemical sulfate reduction, deep reactions between buried hydrocarbons and sulfate minerals at high heat, though the exact balance is debated. The neighboring Kashagan field offshore in the Caspian is another sour carboniferous platform with the same deadly chemistry. A reef that once shimmered with reef life now exhales a single killing breath. And the next field was pumping oil out of a catastrophe. Number 4. The Cantarell field. In the Bay of Campeche, in the southern Gulf of Mexico, oil first announced itself not to a geologist but to a fisherman. In 1961, a man named Rudecindo Cantarell kept finding his nets fouled by crude welling up from the seabed. He reported it. The field that bears his name was developed by Pemex from 1979 and grew into one of the most productive oil fields the world has ever seen, peaking around 2.1 million barrels per day in the mid-2000s. Now consider where that oil sits. A major part of the Cantarell reservoir is impact breccia, a chaos of shattered, jumbled carbonate rubble. That rubble was made on the single worst day in the last 100 million years of Earth history. About 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck the Yucatan Peninsula and blasted out the Chicxulub crater, a scar roughly 180 to 200 kilometers across. The impact threw out a vast apron of broken rock and collapsed debris, and some of it came to rest in what is now the Bay of Campeche. That brokenness is exactly why the field is so rich. Shattered, rubbly rock holds and moves oil far better than solid limestone. So the crews at Cantarell were, quite literally, pumping fuel out of the wound that ended the age of dinosaurs. The crater itself was first traced through gravity and magnetic maps made by the Pemex geophysicists Antonio Camargo and Glenn Penfield in the late 1970s, years before the world understood what they had found. In 1980, the team of Luis and Walter Alvarez proposed that an impact caused the Great Extinction, based on a spike of iridium in the rock. The boundary it marks, the KPG boundary, records the death of the non-avian dinosaurs and around 75% of all species. Geologists still debate how much of the reservoir is true impact breccia versus reworked debris flows, and whether the Deccan volcanic eruptions in India share the blame for the extinction. The impact released energy billions of times greater than the Hiroshima bomb, triggering tsunamis, global wildfires, and an impact winter. The ring of cenotes across northern Yucatan still traces the buried rim. In 2016, a scientific expedition cored the crater's peak ring directly. The dinosaur's grave became a gas station. And the next discovery built an entire province. Number 5. The Leduc Devonian reef. On the 13th of February, 1947, in a snowy field south of Edmonton, Alberta, a crowd gathered around a well called Leduc No. 1. Imperial Oil had drilled well over 100 consecutive dry holes across Western Canada and was close to giving up. Then this one came in. They lit the flare for the public, a pillar of fire against a winter sky, and that moment is remembered as the day modern Canada's oil age began. What the drill had struck was a reef, 375 million years old. It belonged to the Leduc Formation of the late Devonian, the period sometimes called the Age of Fishes. In those days, Alberta sat near the equator, drowned under a warm tropical sea. The reef was not built by the corals we know today. Its architects were stromatoporoids, sponge-like reef builders, alongside tabulate and rugose corals and algae. When the reef died and was buried, its porous carbonate was capped by tight shale and evaporate, creating a perfect trap a mile beneath the prairie. Leduc proved that Devonian reefs were the prize, and exploration exploded. The Redwater Field came in 1948, another giant reef. Then Swan Hills, Rainbow, and Zama, all buried reefs, all major producers. On seismic surveys, these buildups appear as pinnacles and atolls rising from deeper water shale. And once geologists knew the shape, they hunted it deliberately. The reef's fossils let scientists reconstruct Devonian marine life and the rise and fall of ancient seas. And those seas were dangerous places to be. The late Devonian was punctuated by mass extinctions, the Kellwasser and Hagenberg events, which devastated reefs across the globe, possibly driven by ocean oxygen loss as the first forests spread across the land and changed the chemistry of the world. The mainstream reads it as a reef trap, pure and simple, but the cause of those extinctions is still argued. Sit with the scale for a moment. This reef predates the dinosaurs by roughly 150 million years. The oil it holds is light, clean crude, nothing like the thick bitumen waiting just to the north. The Leduc No. 1 site is now preserved as a museum. A reef that had been dead for 375 million years effectively created the wealth of a Canadian province. But to find any of these fields, someone first had to read the rock. And that story is stranger than it sounds. Number 6. The foraminifera that steer the drill. The oil industry, for all its steel and horsepower, is secretly run by creatures you cannot see. Foraminifera are single-celled marine organisms that build tiny shells of calcium carbonate, most of them smaller than a grain of sand. They have existed since the Cambrian and became abundant from the Carboniferous onward, and, crucially, they evolved fast. Different species lived in narrow windows of time, which means that finding a particular species in the rock tells a geologist exactly how old that rock is. This is the science of biostratigraphy, and it is the quiet engine of petroleum exploration. The breakthrough came in the 1920s on the Gulf Coast of the United States. Oil companies needed a way to match rock layers from one well to the next, deep underground where no one could see. 3 micropaleontologists, Esther Aplin, Alva Ellisor, and Hedwig Neiker, proved between about 1920 and 1925 that foraminifera could do it. While large fossils shatter in a drill bit, these microscopic shells survive intact in the small chips of rock that drilling brings up. Those chips, called cuttings, flow to the surface continuously. They are washed, sieved, and studied under microscopes right at the well site. The information is astonishingly practical. Planktonic forams, the floating kind, give global time markers. Benthic forams, the bottom dwellers, reveal how deep the ancient water was. An expert reading the cuttings can tell a drilling crew, almost in real time, whether they have hit the target formation or sailed straight past it. Those calls are worth millions of dollars. Certain assemblages even signal that a source rock or reservoir is near. These shells record more than oil. The oxygen isotopes locked in their carbonate preserve the temperature of ancient oceans, which is why the same fossils now anchor the science of past climate. Larger relatives, the nummulites, built entire limestone formations, including the stone of the Egyptian pyramids. The extinct fusulinids are key index fossils for the Carboniferous and Permian, and they vanished in the end Permian catastrophe. At the KPG boundary, the ornate Cretaceous forams disappear abruptly and tiny survivors take over, the extinction written in miniature. Today, scanning electron microscopes reveal their architecture in breathtaking detail, and there is ongoing debate about whether automated imaging will replace the human specialist. Either way, the smallest fossils on Earth quietly direct one of its largest industries, and sometimes the drills bring up creatures that are anything but small. Number 7. The Athabasca oil sands, sea monsters. In northeastern Alberta lie the Athabasca oil sands, among the largest petroleum deposits on the planet. The oil here is bitumen, thick and tar-like, soaked into Cretaceous sands of the McMurray Formation, around 110 to 115 million years old. In the Cretaceous, a great inland sea called the Western Interior Seaway repeatedly flooded this region, and so the giant shovels of the Suncor and Syncrude mines, digging for fuel, keep tearing into an ancient seabed and lifting out its dead. Most people know the headline find, the spectacular armored dinosaur unearthed at the Suncor Millennium Mine in 2011, but it is far from the only thing that comes out of that ground. The mines and equivalent Cretaceous rocks have yielded plesiosaurs with their long serpentine necks, ichthyosaurs shaped like dolphins, and mosasaurs, the great marine lizards. The Royal Tyrrell Museum in Drumheller curates many specimens pulled straight from industrial sites. Then there is the strangest harvest of all, ammonite. Ammonite is gemstone-grade fossilized nacre, the iridescent mother of pearl of ammonites, mainly the species Placentitras, recovered from the Bear Paw Formation of southern Alberta, a marine shale around 70 to 75 million years old. Its blazing colors, greens and reds and electric blues, come from the microscopic structure of stacked aragonite platelets, the same material that makes a pearl. It was granted official gemstone status in 1981 and is mined commercially near Lethbridge. Long before any of that, the Blackfoot people called it Iniskim, the buffalo stone, and held it sacred. Because earth moving on this scale shifts staggering volumes of rock, paleontologists now work alongside the companies, and Alberta law makes any significant fossil the property of the Crown, so finds must be reported. The famous armored dinosaur survived in such detail, with skin, armor, and even its last meal preserved, precisely because its body sank into the marine seabed and was buried fast, in the very setting now mined for oil. That is the unsettling symmetry of the place. The bitumen and the monsters share one origin. Both are the remains of the same Cretaceous sea, one rendered into fuel by bacteria, the other turned to stone. There's even debate over the ethics of recovering fossils from active mines, and over exactly how ammonite forms. But the basic truth is simple and eerie. The line between the oil industry and paleontology here is about 1 shovel width wide, and the oil itself is sometimes made of things even smaller and stranger. Number 8. The Monterey Diatom Graveyard. Much of California's oil is made of glass, not literally window glass, but the silica shells of diatoms, microscopic single-celled algae, that build ornate cases of pure silica around themselves. The rock that holds this story is the Monterey Formation, a marine deposit between roughly 6 and 18 million years old from the Miocene, exposed and buried all across coastal California. It is the source of much of the state's oil, from the San Joaquin Valley to the Santa Barbara Channel. In the Miocene, cold, nutrient-rich water welled up along the California coast and fed enormous blooms of diatoms. As generation after generation died, their glass shells rained down to the seafloor and piled into thick beds of a rock called diatomite. The organic matter buried with them slowly cooked into kerogene, and the kerogene became oil. The diatomite itself is so pure in places that it is quarried for filters and abrasives, and the Lompoc Quarry is among the largest of its kind in the world. But the Monterey did not only bury algae, it preserved giants. Fossil whales, dolphins, seals, fish, and seabirds lie in its layers, including early baleen and toothed whales. The fine, oxygen-starved mud preserved delicate details. individual fish scales, the outlines of soft tissue. In some places, there are mass mortality fish beds, thousands of fish entombed in a single layer, the record of a sudden die-off, perhaps from a toxic algal bloom or a crash in oxygen, though which one is still debated. The chemistry underground is its own slow drama. The silica transforms with depth and heat from soft opal to a denser mineral form, and finally to quartz, and that transformation shapes how the rock holds oil. In the 2010s, the Monterey was hyped as a vast shale oil prize, then sharply downgraded when the geology proved too contorted, a cautionary tale about reserve estimates. Diatoms only rose to dominance in the oceans during the Cenozoic, so the Monterey records a relatively young chapter of Earth's history compared with the Devonian reefs and the pre-salt lakes. Its white chalky cliffs are not made of carbonate at all, but of silica shells. Every offshore platform and roadside pump jack drawing on this rock is tapping the stored sunlight of Miocene algae. The 1969 Santa Barbara spill, a turning point for the environmental movement, came from a reservoir tied to this formation. The dead of the Monterey were tiny. The next deposit holds the dead of an entire ocean. Number 9. The Marcellus and Bakken Black Shale Seas. Two of the most consequential rocks in modern history are black, brittle, and unremarkable to look at. The Marcellus Shale is a Middle Devonian black shale, around 380 to 390 million years old, lying beneath New York, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, and Ohio. The Bakken Formation, around 360 million years old, straddles the late Devonian and early Mississippian in the Williston Basin of North Dakota, Montana, and Saskatchewan. Both are the remains of dead seas. They formed in oceans where the bottom water held no oxygen. In normal seas, dead plankton rots and its carbon is recycled, but in these stratified, suffocating basins, the organic matter simply piled up and was preserved, layer upon layer, until it became the black, carbon-rich rock that would later yield gas and oil. The Marcellus formed in a basin flexed downward by the rising Acadian mountains as the supercontinent Pangaea began to assemble. Its black color is a direct measure of how much dead life it contains. For most of the 20th century, these rocks were known but worthless. The oil and gas were locked in stone too tight to flow. That changed in the 2000s when horizontal drilling was combined with hydraulic fracturing, the technique called fracking, which cracks the shale open with high-pressure water, sand, and chemicals. The Marcellus became the largest natural gas-producing formation in the United States. The Bakken drove North Dakota past 1 million barrels of oil per day. In barely a decade, these dead Devonian seas reshaped global energy markets and geopolitics. The seas that made them were the age of fishes, ruled by armored placoderms like the monstrous Dunkleosteus and by early sharks. And the same oxygen loss that suffocated those seas, the anoxia tied to the late Devonian extinctions, is exactly what created the source rock. One leading idea holds that the spread of the first great forest pumped nutrients into the oceans and triggered that anoxia, meaning the rise of land plants may have helped cook the rock we now burn. Geologists measure the buried carbon and the rock's thermal maturity to judge its worth, and they date these shales using conodonts, the tiny tooth-like fossils of eel-like animals. There are real costs. The Marcellus carries naturally radioactive material and salty brines that make wastewater disposal a serious problem, and the environmental debate over fracking is far from settled. But the core fact is stark. These fields are suffocated oceans, compressed and cooked into fuel. The conditions that killed the sea are the reason the rock is rich, and the largest such inheritance of all lies in South America. Number 10. The Orinoco Heavy Oil Belt. Along the northern bank of the Orinoco River in eastern Venezuela lies a deposit so large it strains belief. The Orinoco Belt, the Faja, contains extra heavy crude and bitumen with original oil in place estimated at more than 1 trillion barrels. Boosted by this deposit, Venezuela's officially proven reserves are the largest in the world by volume, surpassing even Saudi Arabia, though much of it is brutally hard to extract. The oil is extra heavy, closer to tar than to anything that flows, and there is a reason. The crude migrated upward over time into shallow sands near the surface, where bacteria went to work on it, eating the lighter molecules and leaving behind thick, degraded sludge. To move it at all, operators must dilute it, heat it, or upgrade it into synthetic crude. and Venezuela once even sold it as a bitumen water fuel called oromulsion. The belt is divided into great operational blocks named Boyaca, Junin, Ayacucho, and Carabobo. Trace this oil back to its origin, and you arrive in the Cretaceous Sea. The source is mainly the La Luna Formation, marine rock laid down between roughly 90 and 100 million years ago and beyond, in oxygen-poor water teeming with plankton. The Cretaceous was a greenhouse world, with high carbon dioxide and warm, sluggish, stratified oceans. Periodically, those oceans slipped into oceanic anoxic events, episodes when vast stretches of sea went oxygen-free. Those events buried staggering quantities of organic matter and produced many of the world's great source rocks, La Luna among them. Here, the theme of this whole journey reaches its grimmest point. The very anoxia that made the oil also drove marine extinctions. The wealth of a modern petrostate is built directly on ancient ecological catastrophe. Geochemists can fingerprint the molecular biomarkers in Orinoco crude and tie them precisely back to the La Luna plankton, a chemical signature linking a national economy to microscopic Cretaceous life. There is genuine dispute over whether so much of this oil should count as proven reserves, since the recovery factors are low and the economics swing with the oil price and with technology. Upgrading the heavy crude is energy intensive and carbon intensive. Together with the Athabasca sands, deposits like the Orinoco dwarf the world's conventional light oil in raw volume. And so the largest hydrocarbon hoard on Earth turns out to be the liquefied bodies of a prehistoric ocean's plankton, an entire drowned world rendered into tar. The pattern is now impossible to ignore, and it is worth understanding exactly how it happens. There is a myth worth clearing away. Oil is not made of dinosaurs, despite the cartoon image. It is made overwhelmingly of marine plankton and algae, the smallest and most abundant life in the sea, with land plants feeding the coal pathway instead. The process begins when that organic matter is buried fast enough, in water poor enough in oxygen, that it does not rot. The dead carbon is locked into the rock as a waxy material called kerogen. Then time and heat take over. As burial pushes the source rock deeper, it enters what geologists call the oil window, roughly 60 to 120 degrees Celsius, where kerogen slowly cracks into liquid oil and gas. Go deeper and hotter, and you get mostly gas. This underground cooker is sometimes called the kitchen, and the temperature depends on burial depth and the local geothermal gradient. Coal follows a different recipe, made from the buried remains of land plants in ancient swamps. While oil and gas are overwhelmingly the work of the sea, the oil once formed migrates out of the dense source rock and upward until it meets a porous reservoir capped by an impermeable seal and held in a trap. Source, migration, reservoir, seal, and trap together make a petroleum system. This single framework explains every site in this list. The pre-salt microbialites, the Monterey diatomite, and the Orinoco crude all trace back to plankton and algae. The Tengiz and Leduc reefs are buried carbonate buildups that became both rock and store. The Cantarell breccia is shattered carbonate turned into a reservoir by an asteroid. The Athabasca sands are a drowned beach, and the Marcellus and Bakken are the source rocks themselves, so tight the oil never escaped. The time depths run from Devonian reefs nearly 400 million years old to Pleistocene tar 100,000 years old. Molecular biomarkers preserved in the oil still carry the chemical signatures of the original organisms, which is how a geochemist can read the dead in a barrel of crude. Oil does more than burn. Again and again, in the same regions where it is drilled, it preserves the dead with uncanny fidelity. Natural seeps reach the surface on several continents and become death traps. A film of asphalt excludes oxygen and bacteria, so bone and even soft tissue can survive for tens of thousands of years. That is the story of Binagadi in Azerbaijan and of its famous cousin in California, and it is why such sites let scientists argue over the predator trap hypothesis, the idea that tar pits catch and overcount meat eaters drawn to struggling prey. The preservation theme runs deeper than tar. The anoxic black shales that make oil also entomb whole fish. The diatomite of the Monterey holds mass mortality fish beds and articulated whales. Amber, itself a fossil resin tied to ancient forests, traps insects in mid-motion. The armored dinosaur from the Alberta oil sands survived in 3 dimensions, skin and armor intact because it sank into the same oxygen-poor seabed that the mines now exploit. The common thread is that the conditions which create and store hydrocarbons, low oxygen, and rapid burial are precisely the conditions that preserve bodies. Oil regions are, almost by definition, fossil treasure houses, and industrial extraction has become a vast accidental form of paleontology, from Azerbaijan to California to Alberta to Venezuela. This accidental science cuts both ways. The fossils preserved in oil country are not just curiosities, they are data. The forams in the cuttings date the rock. The whales in the diatomite reveal the ancient productivity of the sea. The amylite records the chemistry of a Cretaceous mollusk shell. The black shales preserve the very extinction events that made them rich. In a strange loop, the dead that became the fuel are also the instruction manual that tells geologists where the fuel will be, so the graveyard and the map are the same rock. Behind every one of these discoveries is a person who learned to read deep time. Antonio Camargo and Glenn Penfield mapped the gravity anomalies of the Chicxulub crater in the late 1970s, sensing a vast buried structure years before science confirmed it had killed the dinosaurs. Esther Eplin, Alva Elisor, and Hedwig Kneiker built the field of micropaleontology in the 1920s and showed an entire industry how to navigate underground using shells too small to see. Sometimes the reader was not a scientist at all. Rudecindo Cantarell was a fisherman who simply noticed oil ruining his catch and reported it, and a world-class field carries his name. Soviet paleontologists at Binagadi spent decades cataloging an Ice Age world that the wider scientific community would barely hear about. The crews at Imperial Oil pushed through more than 100 dry holes before Leduc No. 1 came in, an act of stubbornness as much as science. Petrobras teams learned to shoot seismic waves through 2 kilometers of distorting salt to image lakes that dried up before the Atlantic was born. In each case, the boundary between engineering and pure science dissolved. Industry data, gathered to find profit, repeatedly advanced our understanding of the planet's deep past, and the deep past repeatedly told industry where to drill. The forms that Apline and her colleagues cataloged to find oil are now the workhorses of climate science. Their shells read for the temperature of vanished oceans. The gravity maps that located Cantarell's crater became central evidence for the theory that explains the death of the dinosaurs. Knowledge gathered for one purpose keeps becoming the key to another, which is perhaps the truest lesson of reading the rock. It would be a mistake to romanticize this. Reaching into deep time is physically dangerous, and people have died doing it. Tengiz is the clearest warning, with its 400-day fire and a gas that can kill in a single breath, and its offshore neighbor, Kashagan, carries the same sour, lethal chemistry. The pre-salt fields fight a quieter battle against salt that flows like slow liquid and can crush steel casing far underground. High-pressure reservoirs are their own hazard. When a drill bit punches into rock-holding fluids under enormous pressure, the result can be a blowout, a violent, uncontrolled release that has destroyed rigs and crews across the history of the industry. The 1969 Santa Barbara spill showed the environmental side of that danger, fouling the California coast and helping ignite the modern environmental movement. Even the seemingly tame shales bite back, with the Marcellus producing naturally radioactive material and heavy brines that are difficult and costly to dispose of safely. The deeper and older the target, the more extreme the temperatures, pressures, and chemistry become. At Tengiz, the hydrogen sulfide is so concentrated that a worker can be killed before the smell ever registers, and the sulfur stripped from the oil now sits in vast yellow blocks across the steppe, a problem with no easy solution. To pull fuel from a Devonian reef or a Cretaceous seabed is to wrestle with forces that the surface world almost never sees, and the rock does not always let go without a fight. Step back from all 10 sites and a single strange truth comes into focus. Nearly everything we burn to move and heat and power our world is the remains of ancient life. A barrel of crude is liquefied prehistory. The pre-salt oil is a fossil lake built by bacteria before the Atlantic Ocean existed. The Tengiz and Leduc fields are reefs that shimmered in tropical seas hundreds of millions of years ago. The Monterey is a graveyard of glass-shelled algae, and the Orinoco is an entire Cretaceous oceans plankton turned to tar. Cantarell is fuel pumped from the very crater that ended the dinosaurs. Each well is a needle dropped into a different chapter of the planet's history, drawing that chapter up into a fuel tank. And here's the part that lingers. It took tens and hundreds of millions of years to lay down this inheritance, and we are spending it in the span of 2 centuries. We live on a world quite literally built of its own dead, walking over buried reefs and drowned seas and ice age graveyards without ever feeling them beneath our feet. The drills feel them. They reach down through the salt and the shale and the shattered crater rock and bring the deep past back into the light, oil and monsters and microscopic shells together. We tend to think of fossils as bones in a museum case, safely behind glass, but the largest fossil of all is the fuel itself. And we set fire to it by the billion barrels without a second thought. The asteroid's wound still holds its crude. The Devonian reefs still hold their stone, and every time an engine turns over, somewhere a piece of a vanished world is finally, after an unimaginable wait, burning.